on this?
Yeah, I totally would have missed it.
Okay, now it's recording. Okay, so I'll just say hi for the recording. Hi, everyone. My name is Shmuel Berman. So today's panel, I'll speak a little bit more about that later. But first I want to introduce the general topic and generally how we got here and why this panel is important. So the first thing I want to bring up is I think it's difficult. This is not such an easy topic to approach for a lot of people. And I don't think that's strange necessarily, just because of the amount of weight and the importance of the Bible in our religious lives, in our civilization. It's like such an important book, both as if you look at it as a secular work and as a religious work. So it's not easy for a lot of people to really look at that and think critically and use the skills that they're used to using in other disciplines, such as when you use it and you look at historical documents or different things. And I'm not comparing, like, those are apples and oranges. Obviously, we shouldn't look at the Bible and other religious works if you have religious belief and you're coming from that background the exact same way you look at secular works. But I think there is something missing. When I consider myself to live in a community that really values critical thinking and doesn't shut ourselves off from modern perspectives and kind of thinking in a different way than just accepting the tradition, and kind of using our own brain to analyze sources and really think about them and examine our own perspectives. But I think beyond just saying, okay, we're open to that, there's another level of saying, okay, understanding new things is really important to me. I'm going to go seek that out, right? That's not something that comes so easily to people. And I don't think the first level is something that should be taken for granted. Right, I think there are specifically Jewish groups which say that we're not going to examine these sources in that way. We're gonna rely on tradition, and that's okay. And those people are entitled to do that. And I think it is a statement even to just say we're open to that, but to actually search that out and really like head on and be like, okay, the Bible is a document that was put down on paper at a certain time. Let's use that and like examine it as a work. That takes some courage, especially when you're coming from a religious perspective, right? So that's part of Iggrot Harari's mission, which I mentioned before, is to have these types of conversations about biblical studies in this case, but in general about different religious works, examining things academically. A couple of weeks ago, we had Professor Susanna Heschel of Dartmouth University talk about the Agadah in the Talmud and the cultural information that contained about that time. And in today's panel, we hope to continue that mission by kind of seeing and not only exploring a little bit of biblical studies right here, although it's truly impossible to go into the depth of that. And Professor Sommer and Professor Berman have written long works about that encompass a lot longer than 40-45 minutes about what that actually entails, but about how we approach that and how to look at that not only as a human being, but as a scholar and as a believing Jew. So just to give you some background on both Professor Sommer and Professor Berman, although I'm sure you guys are aware of the works and the amazing stuff they've published. Professor Sommer is a professor of Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Beforehand, he was the director of Jewish Studies at Northwestern University, and his book, which is Revelation and Authority, amazing work, by the way, received the Goldstein-Goren Prize in Jewish Thought and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Oh, it's right there. You can see the cover.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, so nice plug right there. And there's a link in the flyer, I think, for if you want to get that as a discount. I would highly recommend the work. If you're looking for the Hebrew edition, it's going to be published in 2021. So that one's not out quite yet, but waiting on that soon. Yeah, and Professor Berman, actually Professor Rabbi Doctor, and wait, Professor Sommer, you're also a rabbi, correct?
I do not have smicha.
You do not have smicha. Okay, fine. Sorry, incorrect about that. But Professor Berman does have smicha, and he's a professor of Tanakh at Bar Ilan University. He graduated Princeton University and Yeshivat Har Zion, and his book is An Imam in Biblical Criticism, Historical Truths, and the 13 Principles of Faith.
So I'll put yours up.
So we got the double plug here, exactly. So we've come full circle. Another amazing book. I've read segments of it. It's been incredibly enlightening just in my own life. That's not a plug or anything. That's just like literally my opinion on it. And it addresses various challenges by academic biblical studies. As you know, it's not so simple. His book has enjoyed critical acclaim, and again, it was also, I think, a National Jewish Book Award finalist. So I think for the attendees here, you can all realize that Professor Berman and Professor Sommer know a little bit about what they're talking about here. This isn't just some random. So I think if it's okay with both of you professors, if you would just explain a little bit about your opinions on going into biblical studies, why the panel today is important, how you yourself started, just a little bit, just 2 minutes, I guess, each of you. I guess we can start with Professor Berman.
Okay. Well, first, I'm sure I speak on behalf of Ben as well, and thanking you, Shmuel and Iggrot for taking this initiative. The interest in it has been really terrific from all quarters, and I think it really speaks to the importance of what we're doing here today. And I think it's important, as I see it, on two levels. Both Professor Sommer and I deeply believe that you can be a believing, feeling Jew and an intellectually critical Jew when it comes to how we relate to our Kitvei HaKodesh, to our Holy Scripture. We go about it a little bit differently. We come to some different conclusions, some different methodologies along the way. But the very fact that it is possible to build this bridge between spiritual and intellectual integrity is something that a lot of people don't think is possible. And we both believe that it's possible. That's why we're here today. The second reason this panel in particular is important is, I think that, friends, it's no secret. We're at a period of enormous tensions within the Jewish community in responses to COVID, and also as American citizens, it's a period of enormous tensions on the eve of an election. And I think that the fact that you have here Professor Sommer, who is conservative, and myself, I am Orthodox, and we are able to discuss these issues. And you know what? This is going to happen. So I saw someone put up a GIF. Ooh, Rumble. No, it's not going to be any Rumble. This is going to be a real example of how what binds us is so much greater and so much deeper. We are good friends. We have been guests in each other's households. And this is going to be, I think, a good display of how you can have very passionately deep differences with somebody, and at the same time conduct the discussion in deep civility and truly in deference.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. Professor Sommer?
So, well, first of all, thank you, Shmuel, and thanks to Iggrot at Columbia, which, by the way, is a great name, very, very clever name. I love that name of your group. Thanks for the opportunity. Josh and I have been having this conversation actually on our own for about a decade or longer than a decade at this point. So it's nice to be able to take this conversation in a way, in a live way, to a public setting. And basically, yeah, I just agree with everything Josh just said. Number one, I think it's extraordinarily important for religious Jews, and actually for that matter, religious Christians, to realize that it's possible to be a believing Jew or a believing Christian. It's possible to be an observant Jew, a Jew who feels obligated under the law, and also without any contradiction to believe that it's possible and necessary to look at the Bible from an intellectual point of view, from a critical point of view, without any blinders on. It's important for us to realize that if we were to say that certain questions are off limits, certain methods of analysis are off limits when we're talking about Torah, when we're talking about Judaism's sacred tradition, then what we would really be doing is we're saying that Torah is weak. We would really be saying that Judaism's sacred traditions need to be sheltered, they need to be put behind a wall, they need to be in a ghetto, because out in the modern world, they're not going to endure. And I think that Josh and I both believe, and frankly, I think that I can speak for the faculty of JTS and the Jewish Studies faculty of Bar Ilan as well, that that sort of attitude would be really terribly insulting to Judaism, would be terribly insulting to Torah. I believe we can look at the Bible using any sort of lens, and that lens might initially create some discomfort for us, but it's not going to hurt the Bible. The Bible, and Torah and Jewish tradition are strong enough to come out of any sort of analysis stronger and still relevant. And for that reason, I think that it's great that you're having this panel discussion, that you're doing not only this discussion, but your group exists, because in a sense you're saying that we want to use our intellectual head, we want to use our Jewish soul together. We don't want to put them into separate boxes as if though the one would be, as if though the one would somehow damage the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, no, totally agree with everything you guys both said. You said that extremely well. Okay, so just for this is for the audience more than both of you. Just a little bit of explanation regarding how the next, I guess 45, 50 minutes are going to go. So we're going to have a panel, and this is the question. I mean, I have the questions beforehand. Don't worry, we'll have time for a Q&A afterwards. And if you have a question even during the Q&A, you can put it whenever you want into the Q&A bubble. This way, like, I mean, I'm not going to answer it when you ask it, but I'll have it for later, and then we can put it in front of the whole panel. If there is some sort of major connection issue during the panel, you can put that also in the Q&A or chat, because I do want to know about that, just in case we can take like a minute to restabilize. And yeah, we'll have time for a Q&A in the end. We'll probably be doing most of it via the chat function, and I'll read them out loud just because I think that's easier technologically. It'll be smoother. We might have a couple people come on the panel to ask. I'm not sure about that. We'll see where we are then. But first, we have the panel, and I'll ask a question. And my hope is that each of these questions will not. I mean, I think Professor Berman and Professor Sommer are much more experienced in this area than I am, but I think most of them, or I hope most of them, will turn into more discussion points than question answer. And I don't think that we need to get through all the questions and all the things I want to bring up today, because again, the goal is not to go through the whole breadth of biblical studies. That would be impossible. But it's to start a discussion and to understand where they're coming from and how you as a viewer can relate to this in the future if you want to get involved. Okay, so let's start the panel, I guess. So the first question, I guess we'll alternate who answers first. So I guess Professor Sommer, you're up first for this one. We spoke a little bit before, and I think you answered this partially, but this is a good question just for people who want to get into this. Is academic Bible study, is it even supposed to be like religious? Like the whole idea of relating to something with your brain, that seems so far removed from like other elements of religion that we typically, the way we perceive Judaism, like tefillah and even Torah study, or like in Talmud, when we do learn with our intellect, it's a very different type than academic. So is this even supposed to be a religious experience?
So is academic biblical studies supposed to be a religious experience? Is modern biblical scholarship, modern biblical criticism supposed to be a religious experience? It is not necessarily supposed to be a religious experience, but it certainly can be a religious experience. When academic study of any subject actually is carried out well and is carried out properly and honestly, it really should be neutral, and therefore it might take us simultaneously in a number of different directions. To be a modern biblical critic, one doesn't have to be religious, one doesn't have to believe in God, one doesn't have to be either Jewish or Christian. But one certainly can be religious. One can be Jewish or Christian and also religious. And I think that it's perfectly normal that we bring our religiosity into our analyses, just as we bring anything about ourselves into our analyses. There's no such thing as a purely objective analysis. And as long as we recognize what we're bringing and the sort of the biases and the points of view that we're bringing to our analysis, and we're honest with our readers about what those sort of four judgments are, it's perfectly fine to bring our religious self into this work. So biblical criticism doesn't have to be carried out by religious people, but very, very often it is, and very often is carried out by religious people who are reading the Bible critically in order to understand their scripture more fully, and thus in order to understand their God more fully. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would say if you go to a meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, I would guess that a solid majority of the scholars there are in one sense or another religious Jews or religious Christians.
Mhm.
Though by no means is that a requirement for the field.
Mhm. Do you think that's because of the reasoning behind it? Meaning there are people who look into, let's say, like study, I don't know, I'm Lahavdil, but like Shakespeare's works in a similar way. But when you study Bible, there tends to be a much more of an impetus behind it to get to the truth of it. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because of you're seeking like more religious truths. But that obviously is not true across the board. There are many people who aren't religious, who still seek to go down that route.
I think that the majority of people, the vast majority, have some religious goal in mind. It may
Hmm.
be, as is the case for me, that I want to understand my Kitvei Kodesh. I want to understand my tradition's sacred literature more fully.
Hmm.
And I want to understand that more fully because it's my responsibility as a Jew to study Torah and to understand Torah better and better every single day. I think that you get the opposite going on too. There are certainly a great many biblical critics, not a majority, but a substantial number, I think, who actually have something of an anti-religious agenda.
Hmm.
I mean, an anti-religious agenda is just as much a religious agenda as anything
Mhm.
else. And I think that there are plenty of biblical scholars who want to deflate Scripture, who want to show that Scripture isn't so special. To some degree, modern biblical scholarship really began with Baruch Spinoza,
Hmm.
and I think that that was his goal. He wanted to deflate Scripture, and we can see this very, very often in biblical scholarship. Um, and I think both religious and anti-religious goals are quite common in the field. Josh, you want to jump in
Yeah,
here?
I'll just say about that. The word religious needs to be explained here a little bit. That I think for viewers, they might think religious means like traditional or to the fundamentalist side. But in a lot of cases, I think, Ben, a lot of our colleagues, and I think Spinoza too, Spinoza would have considered himself a religious individual. But the religion that they have is, it might be something that's very different than what I or maybe many of the viewers here might consider religious. Their religion might be of a very liberal form, and they're looking to bring the whole view of Scripture in line with their liberal religious approach. So to say that the majority of our colleagues are religious might indeed be so, but I think viewers might think, oh, you mean everybody there is like a rabbi or observant of halacha or the equivalent in Christian terms, and that's not necessarily the case, even if they are religious. So
Right. Yeah, that's an important point, Josh. When I say religious, that probably a majority of biblical scholars are religious. I don't mean that a majority of let's say, the Jewish scholars are Orthodox. I don't mean that a majority of the Protestant scholars are evangelical or fundamentalist. Some are, a substantial number are, but probably there's a larger number of, let's say, Protestant scholars of the Bible who are not fundamentalist, who are not evangelical, who consider themselves to be religious Christians, but in a way that would be very different than, say, a Southern Baptist. And many of the Jewish scholars have a very deep personal connection to these texts, but they're not necessarily, but they're not Orthodox Jews. So yeah, when I'm using the word religious Jew, that's not at all the same thing as an Orthodox Jew. Orthodox Judaism is one type of religious Judaism,
right,
the only one type of religious Judaism.
right,
Hmm.
right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Professor Berman, you want to say something?
Okay, so yeah, so the question, should academic Bible study be religious? Let me speak about that first from a Torah standpoint, okay? And I would say anything that a Torah observant Jew does, anything that a person who considers himself a religious Jew, everything that they do should be a religious endeavor. Everything. Whatever you do for a living should also be infused with some sense of how you're serving the Almighty through this. And it's certainly no different for a religious Jew. And that doesn't mean you have to be Orthodox. Anybody who's coming as a religious Jew who has a deep connection with the Almighty and is lurking to serve them with all their heart and all their soul, then their biblical study also has to be that. It might lead to all sorts of different conclusions, just as Ben comes to different conclusions than I do. But I am certain that Ben engages his study of the Bible as an act of avodat Hashem, of serving the Almighty. So first of all, just a Jew, no matter what you are, okay? If you are coming as a religious Jew, your academic work should be in a form of service of the Almighty. That's the first thing that I would say. Then to the other side, well, what about in terms of the purity, the rigor that is involved in academic work? Can one bring, not just be, obviously anyone can be Shomer Shabbat, observant of the Sabbath, and do biblical criticism. The question is there a place to bring one's religiosity, even his orthodoxy or her orthodoxy, into the biblical study? And my answer is categorically yes. Categorically yes. There's no analysis from nowhere or from a pedestal that's above. Okay, when people come and assess the literary unity of a text, they are coming from somewhere. They might come from a traditionalist perspective, which tends to look for the unity in the text, or they might come from a whole set of poetics that we get from Aristotle without even knowing that it's from Aristotle, but they're coming from somewhere. And the key is, once you come with your perspective, let's say you're coming as I do, as a traditionalist Jew, as an Orthodox Jew, and therefore probably with a proclivity to see unity in the text, the key will be, am I able to find signs of this unity that I can there share with my colleagues who are not Orthodox, and then they see it as well? Then I've made a contribution to the field because of my religiosity, but is something that you don't have to be religious in order to understand or to agree with. And I think that there are many areas where this comes out. And I would say that the work that I've done, that I've received the highest accolades for, are precisely the things that I've come to academia with this on my head and informing what I was looking for, and then lo and behold, able to find it again in terms that spoke to others. Okay? So that's how I see it.
If I could just piggyback a little bit on that. So Josh mentions the idea that some scholars come for religious reasons with something of a commitment, with a forejudgment to find unity in the text. And I think that's completely legitimate. Everybody comes with forejudgments of one kind or another that sort of give them a proclivity to find X or to look more for X or investigate X. That's totally legitimate. I think that I come as a religious Jew to the Bible generally and to the Chumash specifically. I come as a religious Jew with something of a forejudgment to find diversity in the text. As a rabbinic Jew, as a conservative Jew, somebody coming out of the rabbinic tradition that has existed for 2,000 years, I put a great deal of emphasis on Judaism's tradition of dialogue between God and the nation Israel, and also dialogue within the nation Israel between different Jews at the same time, who are having a machloket l'shem shamayim, who are having a disagreement for the sake of heaven, and also dialogue between Jews of different generations, who over generations are talking to each other. I pick up the Mishnah, and on the first page of the Mishnah, there's a question about when we recite the Shema, and then we get 3 answers, not one answer, but 3 answers. In that particular case, one of the answers is then selected as the correct one, but we're supposed to learn the other 2. Of course, anyone who's learned Mishnah or who's learned Talmud knows that there are plenty of cases where there are multiple answers and there isn't a conclusion as to which answers are correct and which answers are incorrect. Given that tendency of rabbinic Judaism to love dialogue, to love discussion, to love debate, I think that specifically as a religious Jew, when I go to the Chumash, when I go to the 5 books of Moses, I come in with a prejudgment that I'm looking for diversity. So here's a place where Josh and I are a little bit different, but I think it's important to realize that both of us are coming to the Pentateuch looking for something for a specifically religious reason. And for a religious reason that comes out of our own tradition.
That you can read more about this in Ben's book. This is like a main thesis of what the book is about. So it's not like there's a book and now there's a discussion. Ben is discussing, a main theme in his work.
And actually, in a way, my previous book, The Bodies of God, that's also that the whole book is really about finding a machloket l'shem shamayim within the Pentateuch about the nature of God. In that other book, I'm looking at the Pentateuch as giving us basically 3 different opinions about who and what God is. And those 3 opinions have been baked into the Pentateuch. There's no compromise, there's no harmonization. We're listening to a debate.
Okay, great. And I just want to piggyback kind of again on what both of you said. This is like, I think Professor Berman said it specifically. both of the professors, their ideas are expressed much more in a much more laid out, much more extensive way in their books. So if you're really looking, and I would highly recommend looking more into this, I think their books are a must-have for getting more in depth in these topics. But okay, so next question. So these two questions are for each of you individually. So I'll ask Professor Berman his question first. So given divine authorship, which you accept, this is a question that I think you spend many chapters, many pages answering elsewhere. So obviously I'm not looking for a full answer. But what's the simplest way to ask someone who asked the question, given divine authorship, why does the Torah repeat so much stuff?
Repeat, as opposed to contradictions. You're asking me the easier question.
Repeat.
Yeah. Right. So, a repetition, just to kind of level the playing field, what we're talking about here, it can be on a gross macro level, such as creation. There's two stories that seem to repeat. Those also contradict. There's repetition. Noach, we just read Noach yesterday in Shul, the story of the flood. How many times does Noah embark the ark? I don't know, 4 times maybe. It says that Noah got onto the ark with all the animals. And over, and so why all this repetition? So in my book, I love to cite a comment made by one of the medieval rabbinic commentators, Rav Levi ben Gershon, the Ralbag, or in English, Gersonides, who lived in Provence in southern France in the 14th century. And at the end of his commentary to Exodus, he raises what in traditional circles is a classic question. He says, here at the end of Exodus, we have an incredible degree of repetition, because in chapters 25 to 31, we have in Exodus all of the details of the tabernacle and the priestly garments laid out to Moses to command Bezalel to build. And then subsequently, in the subsequent chapters, we have all those details repeated all over again when Bezalel actually goes and executes those commands and makes them. And Gersonides, Ralbag, he asks a question, and he says, I'm bothered by the repetition. I'm not just bothered by the repetition because I don't understand why is all of it's here, but he says, this bothers me theologically. He says, because my aesthetics, living here, he doesn't say this, but essentially he's saying, me living here, when I do, in the 14th century, here in Provence, for us, a perfect literary composition has no repetition. Everything is succinct, much like us. You give a composition to your English teacher, she hands it back to you, very wordy. You said this several times, you need to say it over and over again. You should get to the point and be succinct. And so Ralbag felt that as well. And so when the Torah needlessly repeats itself over and over, this becomes not only an exegetical question, it's a theological question. And Ralbag, Gersonides says, I've read all of the classical answers to this question, and I don't like them at all. And then he pulls a brilliant stroke. It's brilliant even for me today. He says, it must be that back at that time, this was the way people wrote. This was the literary convention. And he says the phrase, and v'yedaber hanavi lefi haminhag, the prophet, referring here to Moses, will speak and will write as according to the convention of the times. Why is this such an important and brilliant stroke? The first for me is that it demonstrates his intellectual humility, that he's ready to say, this obviously is deficient. For me, it's obviously deficient, but I know that I live in a certain place and a certain time. And maybe once upon a time, people thought differently and wrote differently. I wish more of my colleagues had that approach. I think the colleagues, my scholars often look at material, okay, we have to give an answer to the data. And therefore, if it doesn't make sense, then it's faulty, it's deficient. And it's very rare that you will find scholars who will say, gosh, there must be something going on here that we're just not in touch with. That's a rather rare move to make. And what's truly remarkable about what Ralbag says is that he was right. That what you find in ancient literature all over the place is that you'll have a composition where you'll have a king speaking to a minister or to a servant, and he'll say, servant, go do A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then the composition goes on, and the servant went and did A, B, C, D, E, and F. This is how they wrote way back when. So it's amazing that he intuitively thought this might be the case. And now we know today in the 20th century, 21st century, just how right he was. And the reason they did this is because ancient writing was largely with mnemonic devices to help people remember things. And we know that repetition helps people to remember. And the takeaway from this, and with this I'll conclude, is the enormous importance of intellectual modesty as we come to the Bible. That we think that when we come, but simply by the God's gift to us that we live in the year 20, we must have 20/20 vision, right? That we're able to understand everything. If it's repetition, it's needless. It therefore must be that there are multiple sources just by dint of the repetition itself. Could it be that, in fact, and this is the case, we are living through poetics of Aristotle, and maybe that blinds us to realities of how people thought and wrote once upon a time? So my message here is, when we come to the text, the fact that we have so much vision and so much knowledge is a blessing, but we also must be very careful to check our privilege. The fact that something might not make sense to us doesn't mean that it didn't make sense to agents in a previous time, in a previous place.
Professor Sommer, before I ask you your question or your response, I just want to say two things. One, for the people who are writing their questions in chat, please only use the chat for if there's an audio issue, put your Q&A questions in the Q&A tab. It's just too disorganized for me to be able to ask it later. So that's one thing. The second thing, Professor Berman, I wanted to comment on something you said, because there's a chapter in Rabbi Sacks's book, I think it's Dignity of Difference, I'm not sure. He writes about how society today is we're living in Plato's shadow, and that influences a lot of the way we view. He mentions biblical studies, I think, in a more general point, but a lot of the way we view religion nowadays. So I think that's a very good point to make, and it definitely, we don't even see all of its effects in how we just it's just our default view of many.
Even if you've never heard of Plato, you're thinking like Plato. That's how pervasive it is. That's right.
So Professor Sommer, if you have a response, or I can ask you your question.
Yeah, actually, I just want to, as the person on the panel who is the source critic, I believe in the documentary hypothesis. As a source critic, as what's called a documentarian or a neo-documentarian, I just want to point out that we documentarians agree with everything that Josh just said. Repetition is a feature of ancient literature. We see it very clearly in Babylonian, Assyrian, Canaanite literature. And the fact of a repetition, such as the one that Josh mentions at the end of the book of Exodus, that kind of repetition doesn't necessarily point to multiple authorships. In fact, the directions for how to build the tabernacle and then the almost word for word repetition of those directions in the past tense describing how the Israelites built the tabernacle, those two passages, Exodus 25 through about beginning of 31, and then 35 through 40, those passages are assigned by us source critics to the P document. That's not an example of, oh, one's J, one's P. So everything Josh just said, we would agree with. There are some kinds of repetition that are different, however. Repetition not in which we're not sort of anticipating an event and then in a repetitious manner describing the same event, but rather repetition where two different events seem to be different versions or different historical memories of what might have been the same event, so that we get two different stories that are very, very similar, but they happen in two different places. Jacob gets a new name, but God gives Jacob a new name, or a divine being gives Jacob a new name, but it happens in two different places, east of the Jordan River, west of the Jordan River. In one place, it's more dialogical. Jacob's more involved, which is typical of the J document. In another place, it's much more top down. God just says, Jacob, you got a new name, it's Israel. Okay, let's move on. One of those stories is a bit longer. The other is shorter and has a sort of less fluid literary style. That's the sort of repetition that we would say, oh, one of those is J and one of those is P. So there's different kinds of repetition, but a source critic would agree with everything that Josh just said about repetition generally and about that particular repetition itself. I don't know if Josh wants to respond, or do we want to just go on to a different question, but as the source critic, I just wanted to point that out.
Right. Let me just throw out one thing, and those are important caveats. Just to, yeah, I want to raise one more thing. I'm currently working on a fascinating figure, the first Bible critic. Many people think it was Spinoza, but really there's another figure who did a much better job criticizing the Bible 6 centuries earlier in Arabic. And his name was, he was a Muslim theologian named Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm, okay? It's very serious, very like the #2 theologian in all of Islamic theology. So he writes this book against trash the Torah, basically. It's a really anti-Semitic. It's, I mean, the things he writes there about Jews, you know, match anything written in the 20th century.
Professor Berman, I
But
don't know
he
if anyone
did a
else is
very
having this issue.
careful critical reading.
Professor
Wait,
Berman, you're
what's
cutting
that?
out a little bit. Can you
Oh,
repeat,
okay.
please?
Okay, let me just see if I'm having any activity issues here. Oh dear. One moment. One moment. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so we're just going to continue. Many of the things that Ibn Hazm identifies are the types of data that source critics point to as demonstrations, not only that it's not written by one hand, and subsequently that we're able to parse out different original sources. What's fascinating is to see that even though Ibn Hazm was holding a magnifying glass to the text, there are certain things that modern critics identify as fissures in the text, this type of repetition being one of them that he never flags. And that's very interesting to me, that here's somebody who was dedicated to being as critical of the text as any modern scholar, probably even more so, because he was vindictive against the Jews. And yet, his own poetics in his time as an Arab Muslim living in the 11th century, there were certain things that are obvious to modern critics, which were not obvious to him at all. So this just demonstrates to me how our poetics, our sense of literary unity, of what constitutes a figure in a text, something that doesn't go together, is very much culturally dependent.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Very good.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great example.
Yeah. So now, Professor Sommer, for your question, a similarly big answer, but obviously not looking for a totally complete one here. Without divine authorship, right? Where do you draw your religious belief from?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't quite agree with the first part of your phrasing there. Mm-hmm. It depends on what you mean by without divine authorship. I don't believe that God wrote every single letter of the 5 books of Moses. I don't believe that the specific wording that we get in the 5 books of Moses was written by God. I think that the specific wording that we find in the Pentateuch, in the Chumash, like the specific wording that we find in the Mishnah or the specific wording that we find in the Gemara, was written down, was composed by human beings, but I believe that those human beings were responding to a real event of revelation, a real communication from a real God at Mount Sinai to the nation Israel. And mm-hmm. I take quite seriously the idea that actually all the generations of Israel were present at Mount Sinai. And Torah, in the expansive sense of the word Torah, that is to say Jewish religious learning generally in all the generations, consists of a series of responses to that event. So I wouldn't begin a description of where I'm coming from with the phrase without divine authorship. I think that there is a divine communication which provokes the various responses that we have in Judaism. Those responses begin with the JEP&D documents, and they continue throughout Jewish history. The latest set of responses is happening on Zoom right now. So first of all, I do see the Torah as a sacred document precisely because in responding to God's nonverbal communication, the Torah is embodying part of that communication itself. Whenever you're answering a question, you are in some way rephrasing the question. The question is then implicit in the answer. So as a religious Jew, I think that I've got an obligation to listen to all these different voices in Jewish tradition and contemporary voices, and with a sense of responsibility towards voices that will be that will emerge 500 years from now. I've got to respect all of those voices. I've got to respect all of those opinions. That doesn't mean I have to agree with all of them, but I've got to take them all serious. I've got to take them all seriously. So when I'm deciding what's within the ill-defined boundaries of Judaism, I don't know where the boundaries are always, but I know that there are boundaries, and there are some things that go over the line. I mean, to take an easy example, Judaism is going back to JEP&D, Judaism is a monotheistic religion. We may need to discuss at length what the word monotheism means and in what sense J's monotheism is different from P's monotheism. But Judaism is always a monotheistic religion. Judaism is a religion that teaches that God created the world. What P meant by that, what J meant by that, and what Maimonides means by that may be different, but we can never say that the world is older than God, which is what a Babylonian would have said, that the world was older than the deities themselves, or what a Greek person would have said. Zeus is a relative newcomer in the history of the cosmos. Marduk was a relative newcomer in the history of the cosmos. We can't say that in Judaism. We can't say that multiple deities created the world. We can't say that there's no deity. There are clearly boundaries, and I think that by listening to all of these different voices, trying to hear them speaking in their own language, I can get a sense of consensus as to what tends to be within and what tends to be without. That's a broad answer. We could go into some more specifics if you're interested, but maybe I'll just go as far as that for now.
Got it. Professor Berman, do you have a response to that? It's fine. If not, we can go on to the next question. Very well said.
Let me just say about what Ben just said. Yeah, it's so important that I want to just highlight something that Ben said. What Professor Sommer just did is to highlight for us how ancient Near Eastern context just shows what a blowaway the Bible really is. That is, if you're living in a time when people the world over are convinced that the world itself predates the gods, to have some work that comes up with the Copernican idea that it's really pum fakert, that it's exactly the opposite, that the world is not infinitely old and that it's created by a God. You don't come up with those ideas just out of nowhere. And I think that the more we get in touch with the ancient Near Eastern context of the Bible, we see more and more how things that we maybe take for granted. Yeah, God created the world. Isn't that obvious? Once upon a time, not at all obvious. It was just the other way around. And this is what I find to be just so exciting about our discipline. The more we discover how radically different in so many things the Torah and the Tanakh generally is on so many scores, I find it personally very inspiring. That's an excellent example of what Professor Sommer just raised for us.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, just to I guess when we're already discussing the views, I think the next logical question, not even the next logical question, but the next question, which I think will definitely illuminate this a little bit, is in regards to both of your opinions. Obviously, you guys have thought this through for many hours over the course of your career. But initially, I assumed that both of you held a certain point, and that may have stayed the same through your studies, but it may have changed. So when we're examining the Torah and the whole Bible, which narrative kind of pushes you to say, okay, the way I view at the way the Torah was authored, this is the way it really happened? Which narrative gives the greatest evidence for your perspective on whether Hashem handed down the 5 books of Moses directly or whether there was different strands? And which narrative has you saying, okay, like it gives you some doubts? What are the 2 things, I guess you would say that there? So Professor Berman.
Okay, so I have to take your question in 2. I'm not sure which of 2 directions you want. There are narratives that for me highlight unity in the Bible, and there are narratives that for me highlight antiquity of the Bible. Those are not the same. So I'm not sure which you had in mind.
So I guess more of unity than antiquity.
Right. Unity. Well, there's a whole bunch, really. Actually, I think that one of the narratives that sells me the most is actually one of the parade narratives for source critics of the justice of their approach, which is the flood story. It is true that the flood story has lots of repetition and even some points, some elements that seem to be in direct contradiction with one another. But as I point out in my book, and as scholars have pointed out, there's remarkable correspondence between the flood story, and only when you read the whole thing through, and the parallel Mesopotamian version of the story in what's called the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. So that it comes out as like 17 straight elements in both stories with really no skipping, in the same order, and they all match up. The whole account of Noah coming out of the ark until he finally disembarks and offers sacrifices, you can see it closely follows the account of creation. And that only works if the whole thing is one running account. So a beautiful chiastic structure. Some scholars are kind of circumspect about our capacity to build chiastic structures. They look very pretty, but they, like a house of cards, they fall pretty easily as well. All these things together with the flood story, it seems to me, really holds together. And there's just other things, you know, anytime you see a pattern, that's going to be for someone looking for unity. If indeed the pattern is really, you know, very solid, this tends to be something that demonstrates unity. Now, that only demonstrates what I've said is the unity of the flood story. That does not account for the unity of the entire 5 books of the Torah, right? That's a taller order to say, you know, what do you see that demonstrates the absolute unity of the entire thing? That's a taller order.
Okay. Could you just also the second part of the question is also which narrative kind of gives you the most, I don't know, I guess doubts is the right word, towards your own approach?
Right. I don't know if there are narratives. I would say the one thing that comes to my mind is when we look at the list of curses in Deuteronomy 28, right? There's that very long chapter of what will happen to Israel if she is not faithful to the covenant. When you begin to learn about ancient Near Eastern curse lists, then what you see is that there are some curses where the closest parallels are from the 7th century, from Neo-Assyrian curse lists. And some of those parallels are really quite close. Now, you know, where that leaves me is, well, it could be that maybe these curses are older and we just haven't dug up, you know, what all the curse lists that are there to be had, or maybe, you know, there might be other ways of dealing with it. I never like to be bound, you know, no matter what the evidence, this is what you must hold. The whole second half of my book refers to this issue of the principles of faith, particularly the 8th principle of faith about the origins of the Torah. And I have 4 chapters there. I won't be able to summarize now, but it's there that I discuss some of the options, and I think flexibility historically about how we as Orthodox Jews can accept the eighth principle of Maimonides, but that there might be different versions of it and different ways of understanding what that acceptance means. This is what this whole second half of my book is about. And as with anything, anybody that reads it and has any questions is always free to write to me.
Okay, great. Same question to you, Professor Sommer. If you want me to repeat, I can.
No, so you're looking for what would be a banner example that convinces me that the documentary hypothesis is correct, and then what's an example of something that makes me wonder about that? That's
yeah, exactly.
So, gosh, in terms of banner examples of what convinces me that the documentary hypothesis is correct, that, you know, frankly, there are just so many where the hypothesis explains the data extraordinarily well. But both because Josh went to Noah and because we read Noah yesterday, well, not in shul, but in someone's backyard, whatever. Because we just got through Parshat Noah. Actually, I would tend to say that the flood story. The flood story, it has not only repetitions, but a number of contradictions, when you look at the repetitions and contradictions together, I think it does kind of come apart very, very easily. And once it's come apart and you look at the two different versions, there's a pattern of similarities and similarities within the versions and contrast to the other versions. So that, for example, they tend to use certain vocabulary. The most famous and in some ways least significant example would be they use two different names for God. They tend to portray God in somewhat different ways, more transcendent, more immanent. They have a somewhat different view of the flood. That is, you can come up with a hypothesis based on the contradictions of which verses belong where. And then once you've come up with that hypothesis, there are nafkaminas from the hypothesis. There are things we can find in each of the putative strands that are consistently distinctive, are consistently different from the other strand. And I do think, and here I'm really disagreeing with Josh in the relevant chapter of Anima Amin, and then also in the longer book, Inconsistency in the Torah, which if you want to, if you really want to study this stuff, this is another one that you'll want to buy by Josh, published by Oxford University Press. I do think that once we divide the text into two parts, the two parts actually read extremely well. Josh points out one point where there's a certain verse or a certain phrase that seems a little bit out of place. Source critics have suggested that one particular verse has been moved a little bit up in the final version of the Torah from where it was in the source. But with that one exception, I think that each of those stories reads very, very well without any bumpiness in a way that the Torah itself does not read. Having said that, I think that Josh's, so I'm saying I basically disagree with Josh's reading of the flood story. However, at the end of his reading, Josh mentions the chiastic structure, and he also mentions the parallels with Gilgamesh. And I think that those do give me pause. The parallels with Gilgamesh, look, to some degree, the fact that the order is the same has to do with the plot of the story. So that's, that might be explicable. And furthermore, we need to recall that both versions of the flood story that we find in Genesis are recollections of some original story. That they're both going back to some original flood story in ancient Israel that the Israelites shared with or borrowed from the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, back where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were from. And so different Israelites may have preserved different parts of that story, and that might explain why both the J and the P versions have these parallels. That having been said, the fact that the parallels work so neatly when we create the charts that Josh has at the end of that part of his book, they really are quite neat, especially when we're looking at the unified text. And that does make me wonder a little bit. There are also parts where Josh finds part of what the J story is saying seems to assume what the P story was saying, whereas I tend to think that J and P were really quite separate. That also makes me wonder. At the end of the day, and I think I find this throughout Josh's work, I'm not convinced by most of Josh's objections to the documentary hypothesis. I think most of those objections tend to be objections to a particular version of source criticism, but not a universally held one. But throughout the book, there are individual points that do give me pause and do remind me, and this is something that I think, some documentary scholars are better than others at remembering. We do have to remember that the documentary hypothesis is just that. It's a hypothesis. There's no clear empirical evidence that it's right. It's an explanation of the data. I think it's a good explanation of the data, but there are pieces of data here and there that seem to go against it. There aren't enough of them to make me think that the whole theory is wrong, but there are enough of them to remind me that it's a theory and I've got to be open to other possibilities as they come up in scholarship.
Great. So I'm just taking a quick look at the time. It's been roughly an hour since we started. There's one more question I want to get to. But then there's a lot of questions also for Q&A. So we're definitely not going to get to all of the original questions, or unfortunately, probably most of the Q&A questions, but we'll try and get to a lot of them. And obviously, I don't know if you both are okay with me giving out your contact information, but if not, you can email. I mean, I'll send an email at the end. You can email questions then, and I'll forward them to the relevant party. So don't worry about that. But the last question I think is important, and I think I forgot who it was who touched on this before, is that at the end of the day, we're all kind of members of two different worlds, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning. So it's nice also. We're part of the modern like critical world, and we're also attempting to place ourselves within the context of a greater tradition, which has people who disagree with us, people who agree with us. It has people, basically the dialogue that we've spoken about before. So how do we balance that, right? Dealing with like being part of a tradition, and then also knowing that like not necessarily everyone in the tradition before us thought of it in a way that's in any way similar to how we're thinking of it. I forgot who I asked the last question to first, so either one of you wants to go first.
So just to make sure that I'm getting this correctly, are you asking, given that we've got interpretations now that are different from anything else that came up in the tradition, and given that some of those interpretations are coming from a wider contemporary or modern secular world, how do we reconcile holding those opinions with our commitment to the tradition? That's the question?
Yes.
Well, I'll take a shot. I think that's part and parcel of what's always happened in Jewish tradition. Starting from the very, very beginning, we can see, I mean, literally starting with the first 3 psukim of Genesis, that the biblical writers were participating in and reacting to the intellectual discourse of their time. I say that we see this in the original the first 3 verses of Genesis, because the first 3 verses of Genesis, as Rashi interprets them, has a certain kind of sentence structure. You can go to Rashi and see what that sentence structure is. Interestingly, when we go to the second creation story, the J creation story, starting in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, right after the Etnachta, we again get that same sentence structure. When we go to Mesopotamia and we go to a text called Enuma Elish, which is a creation epic from the ancient Near East, we see at the beginning of Enuma Elish that same 3-part sentence structure. And when we go to another Babylonian or Mesopotamian creation story known as Atrahasis, again, we see that same 3-part sentence structure. In Atrahasis, you might actually interpret it slightly differently as 2 parts, which is actually how Rashbam reads Genesis 1 through 3 anyway. One way or the other, Rashi and his grandson Rashbam were pointing out to us a certain syntax at the beginning of Genesis, which turns out to be typical of the ancient Near East. So right at the very, very beginning of the Bible, the biblical authors are saying to us, we're part of this intellectual world. But as Josh was pointing out earlier, building on something that I had said, they're using those conventions of how you begin to narrate a creation story to present a creation story that completely reverses the traditional ancient Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean idea of what creation means and where the world comes from and what's the relationship between divinity and cosmos. So right off the bat, at the very beginning of the Tanakh, we see that Jewish intellectual life absorbs and sometimes responds to the intellectual life of what's around it. We go to rabbinic literature, the same thing is happening. Lots of scholars have talked about the ways that Hellenistic and Roman literature have influenced the Bible, the rabbis, but the rabbis are moving in other directions. More recently, a number of scholars from Yeshiva University and elsewhere have talked about how the Bavli is in many respects very much a product of its Persian milieu. And yet the Bavli's religion is different from Zoroastrianism. That keeps on happening all the way through Jewish history. Probably the greatest example of that in all of Jewish history is Maimonides, who in some ways is a radically un-Jewish thinker. You know, the scholar who, a lot of my own work is really just a series of footnotes to the work of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Abraham Joshua Heschel's entire career was a long, respectful, deeply respectful wrestling with Rambam because he just saw how much of an Aristotelian Greek thinker Rambam was rather than a Jewish thinker. And yet ultimately, Heschel respects Rambam because, of course, the truth is that Judaism did embrace Rambam. He's the most important Jewish philosopher ever, hands down. Whoever's number 2, we can debate, but number 2 is far behind him. That keeps on happening all through Jewish history. So the extent to which I learned something really important from secular non-Jewish scholars, sometimes even from secular anti-Jewish scholars like Julius Wellhausen, one of the greatest biblical critics ever, who really didn't like Judaism. He was not an anti-Semite, but he didn't like the Jewish religion. And I have a problem with a lot of what he wrote, but he was a great scholar, and I've learned an enormous amount from him. I've learned an enormous amount of Torah from my close colleague at Notre Dame, Gary Anderson, who's a very devout Catholic. And I'm proud to say how much Torah, as a religious Jew, I've learned from Gary in the way that Gary writes as a modern scholar who's a devout Catholic. That's perfectly normal. That's been going on in Jewish tradition. That's what Maimonides was doing. That's what the author of Genesis 1 was doing. And so I in a sense, I don't fully understand the question. I don't think that there is a question. It's as we absorb elements into Judaism, it's my opinion that as a religious Jew, it's my opinion that those can only strengthen, not harm.
Mm-hmm.
Very good answer. Professor Berman, if you want to say some things.
Yes, I fully agree with things Ben said. Let me give it a spin that's going to sound more frum, more traditional, okay? I'm going to restate the question. So for thousands of years, we have been carrying on our Masorah, our tradition. We have taken the interpretations that were given us from the Medrash, from the Talmud, from our medieval exegetes, and we have been publishing them and studying them and thinking through their lens about how to read Scripture, how to read the Torah. And now here we come, the two of us and the guild that we represent, and we say, and we're saying it in the name of religion, we can read all sorts of other things. We can read all sorts of ancient texts that Rashi and the whole rabbinic tradition had no idea about. And we can read all of these non-Jewish scholars, even the anti-Semitic ones amongst them, as Ben said. And all of it we're going to incorporate into our Torah. How do you do this? What's the license to do that? Okay, so let me cite here an idea that it's very prominent in the writing of Rav Tzadok Milublin, a major Hasidic and incredibly bold thinker in Poland in the 19th century. And it's found also in many places in the writings of Rav Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook, Rav Cook, at the beginning of the 20th century. And that is that the Almighty places us in a certain place in a certain time. And he does so for the purpose of us being exposed to what's happening in that time and in that place. And that it is the responsibility of each and every generation of Jews, if I use Kabbalistic terms that are already in the Orach Chaim, one of the early modern commentators in the Sephardic tradition, to gather in the sparks. Okay, this is how they speak, that there are things out there that are worthy, that will make our Torah a greater Torah, perspectives that we as Jews need to adopt and adapt in order to be able to properly understand Scripture in our time. In other words, both of these figures were against the idea of the outside world, modernity. It's like walls of water that we constantly need to be pushing away lest we get wet. No, and the answer is we're supposed to go swimming. We're supposed to engage this stuff without losing track of the tradition, knowing the limits, but that this is our challenge. This is why God has put us here and now in order to do this.
Beautiful answer. I wish I could ask more questions. Unfortunately, we've gone, and I do want to give a little time, although we're not going to have so much time for the Q&A. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming. If anyone needs to go at this point, it's been obviously the panelists are going to stay for more questions. So don't leave just yet. There's definitely more to be discussed here, but thank you all for coming if anyone has to leave now. And before you go, actually, I'm going to put an email in the chat, and that's the Iggrot Hari email. So if you're interested in hearing about more of our events in the future, if you're interested in asking a question to Professor Berman, Professor Sommer, I assume their contact info you can find on Google, but if you want to just send it to us, I'll forward it to the relevant party, and you'll get an answer. And yeah, just contact us if you're interested, if you want to hear about our future events or whatever. And I also want to give both Professor Sommer and Professor Berman, if you want, just to speak. I mean, ideally not too long, because I want to give some time for Q&A about your book a little bit. So I guess Professor Sommer, why don't you speak first?
Let's see, about the book.
Just 30 seconds, just like
30
some
seconds.
intro for the viewers.
So the book is trying to answer the question. You could phrase the same question in two ways. One, in some sense, I started writing that book, although it's my third book or my fourth, depending on how you count. I really began writing it years ago when I was in graduate school as a way of trying to answer the question, how can you be a religious Jew and also a biblical critic? And I want to explain in the book, and I've been trying to explain to people, throughout my career, how I don't see any contradiction between being a religious Jew and a biblical critic. In fact, on the contrary, being a biblical critic is one of the ways that I express myself as a religious Jew.
There you go. There you go.
So that's, in a sense, that's one way that you could understand what the book is about. Another maybe broader way of saying something that's more or less the same is the project of the book is to show you that just because you no longer believe in the version of the Torah min hashamayim, the version of revelation that you were taught a long time ago, that maybe you were taught as a kid, that doesn't mean that you don't have to put on tefillin or light Shabbat candles. You can believe that human beings wrote the actual words of the Torah and still regard yourself, still understand yourself to be mechuyav, to be obligated, to observe the commandments, because these are God's commandments, even if human beings wrote the specific wording of those commandments. To put it in sort of like in internal Jewish language, the book is trying to show that just because you don't believe in the version of Torah min hashamayim that you learned from your Rebbe in third grade, that doesn't mean that you're in any way patur. That doesn't mean that you should have any problem accepting Ol Malchut Shamayim and Ol Mitzvot. That's really that's what the book is trying to do. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, fine. And Professor Berman, same thing. Just it doesn't have to be anything extensive. Just oh yeah, and Professor Sherman will hold it up while you say it as well.
Yeah. Right. So my book, the aim was really largely similar to what Ben is trying to do, to build a bridge of spiritual and intellectual integrity between these two seemingly incompatible worlds, or at least that's the way many people view it. I wanted to touch on major issues. Does the Torah cohere together as a literary whole in a way that might be more than what some critics say? Some things about the authenticity of the stories. How do we relate? The basic questions that many people have. Does the Torah hold together? Are the stories true? How do we relate to that? The antiquity of the Torah, its origins. How can we relate to that theologically? That's the whole second half of the book about the place of the Ikarei Emunah and what it means that we've accepted them and which version and which text, etc. And beyond that, I really wanted to go beyond just really the question of biblical studies and biblical criticism, but to demonstrate just how much we have to learn that's incredibly exciting and inspiring about seeing the Torah in ancient Near Eastern context, and just generally giving traditionally minded Jews a sense from within sources within the tradition about how things evolve and things change, and that those aren't dirty words. Okay, and that's also part of what's going on here, but how to do that within a very traditional way that doesn't threaten our halachic practice in any way.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we're now going to transition to the Q&A. Unfortunately, I planned at the beginning to have some people on the panel, but I don't think that's a good idea given our time constraints, and it's just going to take more time. I think if anyone has a question, by the way, put it into the Q&A, but well, now I don't think we're going to get to everyone, so let me just read a question here. Okay, so this is actually, I'm going to read, if anyone, I don't know if anyone intended to be anonymous or not, so I'm just not going to read the names in case, because I don't want anyone to have that, but whatever. The flood story has parallels with other ancient Near Eastern flood stories, etc., and he gives some examples. Why should we not think of the Torah as building onto the stories that already existed? And the question I think here is, why would a divine being purposely put facts in the Torah that don't hold up under today's scientific lens? So I assume this question is more directed towards you, Professor Berman. I think, but Professor Sommer, if you want to answer as well, also. But Professor Berman, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is a longer question than I really am able to answer here, but I do in the book. And that is that we come today with an expectation that something that's going to be true is going to be based on facts. Anything that deviates from facts is not true. It's fake news, okay? And my one of my big messages in this book is that this is not an appropriate way to read the Torah. Not only is it wrong from a critical perspective, I think that it is also wrong from a traditionally Jewish perspective. Okay, just one example that demonstrates this, right? The very famous statement in the Gemara that everyone who says that David committed a sin with Bathsheba is wrong. Well, then you have to ask, why does it say that he did all these things, right? So it's clear that that opinion in the Gemara does not believe that everything in the Tanakh is factually true. Okay. Now, how do we bridge this gap between our expectation that everything must be factually true, otherwise it's fake news, otherwise it's a denigration to the Torah? This is a modern mishagas, folks. Okay. Pre-modern people didn't think like this. Why? How? What's he talking about? For that, you got to read the book. Okay. But what I'm going to tell you is that if you think that it's facts or it's fake news, then I'm going to tell you, you are fake Jews. That's my
nice.
Nice at the end.
I've been working on that one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I just piggyback on that, I really very, very strongly agree. To my mind, one of the most important aspects of modern biblical criticism, maybe the most essential aspects of modern biblical criticism, is that we modern biblical critics are trying to read the Tanakh as it was understood by its first audiences in ancient Israel, which is to say, we're trying to read the Tanakh as the ancient Near Eastern document that it is. That's the academic project of modern biblical criticism, whether done by a religious person or a not religious person, a Jew, a Christian, whatever. And if I can make two comments about that. One, I think within the field of biblical studies, one of the best presentations of that goal of modern biblical criticism and why that goal matters is what you get in the first half of Ani Ma'amin, is what you get in the first half of this book of Josh's. He just does a spectacular job of explaining what were the genre expectations of the ancient writers and of the ancient readers, the ancient audiences who are hearing these texts being read or chanted out loud, and how does that change the way that we understand them. In the 19th century especially, among Protestants, an idea began to arise that things that are in the Bible have to be historically and scientifically true, as 19th century Western culture was defining what true means. And this created either a crisis for some Protestants who just lost the Bible, or a retreat behind very, very high fundamentalist walls for other Protestants. And agreeing with those definitions, those 19th and 20th century definitions of what a fact is not a Jewish thing to do. It's also not a Catholic thing to do or an Eastern Orthodox thing to do. That's not the authentic way that a Jew reads the Bible. That's number one. Number two, what is the essence of pshat? A number of different scholars, including my own teacher, Michael Fishbane, have talked about pshat as being, above all, an exercise in anava, an exercise in humility, in subjecting ourselves to the text and the way the text presents its own material. That's what pshat is all about, going back at least to Rashbam. And if we're going to subject ourselves to the text, if we're not just going to sort of force our opinions onto the text, but we're going to try to hear the text talking in its own language, then we've got to study ancient Near Eastern literature to understand how that language of thought works. And we have to make sure not to bring our Western ideas about what history is or what science is supposed to be to a text that never intended to present science or history in the modern sense. When we read Genesis 1 as if though it were science, or even the stories of David as if though they were history in the sense that they do it over in the history department at Columbia, we're creating a genre error, and we are inevitably, A, misunderstanding the text on an academic level, and B, treating the text disrespectfully, because we're not subjecting our view to the text view. As religious readers, we should be academically honest, but as religious readers, we should also have the anava, have the humility to subject ourselves to another way of talking. And I think that these opening chapters of Ani Ma'amin, you're getting a series of examples of how a religious Jewish reading has to pay attention to the ancient Near Eastern context of the Tanakh.
Great answer. Okay, so I think we're maybe only going to do one or two more questions because I think we've been here for a while. So I guess maybe we'll make this the last one. And by the way, that doesn't mean no one else is going to get their questions answered. Obviously, send us an email and we'll forward it, as I mentioned before. Okay, so this one, I assume it doesn't mention, is directed more towards Professor Sommer. The notion that the Bible, at least superficially, has internal tensions and contradictions cannot be denied. But isn't documentary criticism, which assigns particular passages to a particular hypothetical author, wildly speculative? And then the follow-up is there any field outside biblical criticism where a similar theory is accepted outside of some sort of independent analysis from witnesses or textual witnesses?
So documentary criticism of the Pentateuch is speculative. It is hypothetical. It's presenting a hypothesis for which we're unlikely to ever find empirical validation, because the texts themselves from the biblical period, written down on leather or on papyrus, they have not survived. It's very, very unlikely that an archaeologist is going to find one of these texts. So it is speculative. Historical reconstruction, by its nature, is speculative. So the question is, how much speculation can we abide by? And I think there's different ways of answering that question. I can only answer it for myself. In regard to the documentary hypothesis, the patterns of consistency that scholars find from Genesis 1:1 to the end of Deuteronomy, or actually even really in some ways into Joshua, are so consistent and so impressive that I think that this theory is probably more or less correct. I would also add that though we can't expect archaeologists ever to find J or to find P, it is interesting that elsewhere in the Bible, we do get texts that seem to know J or P. So for example, in particular, Psalm 78. Psalm 78 retells a number of stories from early Israelite history, and it always is telling the J version. Even when we're dealing with texts that in the Torah as we have it have been woven together, Psalm 78 always, you might say, paskins by J. I think it's very clear that the author of Psalm 78 owned a copy of J and probably did not own a copy of E, P, or D. Deutero-Isaiah, the author of Isaiah 40 through 66, which was the subject of my first book, quotes and alludes to the Torah on a number of occasions. And every single time Deutero-Isaiah does so, Deutero-Isaiah is always alluding to a particular verse from one of the sources, even if now in the Torah that we have it's put together with the other sources. Whenever Deutero-Isaiah refers to the Torah, Deutero-Isaiah always refers to J or E or P or D, never refers to psukim that seem to combine them. I think that shows that in the Babylonian exile, Deutero-Isaiah, who is a deeply, deeply learned author, had these traditions, but didn't know these traditions as having been put together. And in fact, Deutero-Isaiah relates to them a little bit differently, especially to P, differently than Deutero-Isaiah relates to J, E, and D. So I think that though we'll never find empirical proof, the Bible itself does have some suggestions here and there that suggest that other biblical authors knew the texts separately, knew the different sources separately. Still, this question is a very, very good question. The fact of the matter is, as I said before, the documentary hypothesis is a hypothesis. It is based on speculation. I think often there is cumulative evidence from speculation. You begin to find patterns that allow us to find further patterns, and those patterns are self-consistent enough that we think that this is a good hypothesis. But at the end of the day, it is still a hypothesis.
Yeah, Professor Berman, if you want to say anything, and then I think we'll end for today.
Yeah, I really appreciated that line of thinking that Ben just raised about, well, okay, we don't have any what we call epigraphic evidence. We don't have things we've pulled out of the ground, that would be just P or just J or etc. But looking towards the other books of the Tanakh and to see how do these other books of the Tanakh relate to the material that's in the Torah. And I was not familiar with what Professor Sommer just told us about Psalm 78, that it really seems to be an Orthodox J text, if you will. Okay. What I've always found of significance, at least for my thinking, is that one mizmor, that one psalm aside, the general rule is that all of the books of the Torah all seem to feel very free to draw from these putative different sources without any attempt to be strictly orthodox. We're only following in terms of either narrative or laws, only one over the other. And if these were indeed schools that were in competition with one another, I might have expected that we would find a book that only went according to covenant code or Deuteronomy or priestly laws, or the same thing with the narratives as well. Or that I would expect to see some figure of authority in these texts jockeying and saying, the only right way to do this law, whether is according to any one of the law codes. That might be a priest, that might be a king, that might be a prophet, that might be the author himself as narrator saying, well, of course we do this and not that. And you just don't find that. Just don't find it. And I would think that if there was really this degree of competition, that we would see it more clearly than we do.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would quite agree with that, in particular in regard to Sefer Melachim. When the Book of Kings, when Sefer Melachim talks about Torat Moshe or Torat Hashem or Sefer HaTorah, and it then refers to a specific legal practice, it pretty much is always referring to the law that appears in D. And that differs from Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah.
Right.
But even Chronicles, when it's retelling the same story that Kings told,
right.
when it refers to the Torah, sometimes it refers to Deuteronomy, and sometimes it refers to something from Exodus, Leviticus, and sometimes it's actually aware of a tension between.
It makes combinations all over the place.
For example, Pesach is a classic example. It's aware of the tension between them, and it's doing midrash halacha to try to resolve that. In post-exilic literature from the Persian period, clearly we see biblical documents for whom the word HaTorah or Sefer HaTorah or Torat Moshe refers to our Pentateuch. And they are all, as Koifman and others have pointed out, they're already doing midrash halacha to try to reconcile these verses that seem different. But Sefer Melachim, when it's talking about the law, it's pretty much always talking about D.
So that would be Korban Pesach. What else do you have in mind?
The nature of cult centralization. Honestly, if you go to BDB, you go to the great Hebrew dictionary, the Brown Driver Briggs dictionary, and you look up the word Torah, they've got a list of times where it's clear that Kings is referring to the book of Deuteronomy specifically. And you can see a whole bunch of them, and you look them up. Lo to avot banim al avot, things like that, that appear in Kings. That too, I think, would be something like the Psalm 78 example, an example where I think we do get something that begins to approach empirical validation for a significant part of the documentary hypothesis.
Very interesting.
Okay, so I think this is a good place to put a semicolon in this discussion for now. Perhaps we'll have some future event in this. Also, this was extremely rewarding and productive today. I know I can speak for myself, and many of the audience members have also emailed me and posted questions regarding that. So Professor Sommer, Professor Berman, thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone in the audience, thank you for coming. If you want the recording to this session, then email me. I don't know if it's going to be available publicly online, but for sure, if anyone wants it, I can email it out. And again, your questions, I know a lot of people didn't get their questions answered, but don't take that as discouragement. You can get your question answered by sending an email. Okay, so everyone have a great day.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Shmuel.
Shmuel, and thank you for the viewers. To be continued.
And thanks, Josh. Great seeing you again, Josh.
And you,
Hopefully
Ben.
sometime when COVID is over in person.
Amen.
Amen.
Can you hear it soon?